Hey, what's up? It's Jim, and today I'm going to talk about the film Cinderella. This is the third in the franchise of Disney kind of redoing their animated hits or repurposing them into live action films. And the other two, Alice in Wonderland and Maleficent, Alice in Wonderland being a kind of a sequel and Maleficent being the story of Sleeping Beauty from the perspective of Maleficent. And Cinderella is more straight than that. It's literally just a big screen adaptation of Cinderella. It's not trying to put a new spin on it whatsoever, which is kind of odd nowadays. When you think of a reboot or a remake, it always has to be a prequel, it always has to be a different version of it. And for the most part, it's not trying to do that. It still plays within those rules that we expect from those kind of things nowadays, which is amazing as always. It is trying to be respectful, clean adaptation than we'd really expect from Kenneth Branagh, especially recently. It's a lot more traditional than you expect from a retread of a proven property, but it somehow is just really as bad as you expect from any of the other live action versions of Disney stories. Sure, it's kind of different in the fact, but it still begs the question, why are we actually doing this, and what exactly is even the point of making them rather than brand recognition? A young girl named Ella who has two loving parents, but then her mother dies of something. They don't tell you. Two characters die of a mysterious thing, and each time they're like, I'm gonna die now, but right before, let me tell you this thing. I don't know what this thing that they died of was. They just don't tell you, but people die of something, and the doctor's always like, comes out and everyone looks like, yeah, the doctor, he looks totally upset, so somebody's gonna die. But her mother dies, and then her father remarries the wicked stepmother that we know from the Cinderella story, played by Cate Blanchett. Although, even though it's kind of like the 1600s in France or something, she's kind of dressed like it's the 40s, but Cate Blanchett pulls it off. The design of this movie doesn't make a lot of sense. So then her dad dies when he's on a trip, and he gets another mysterious death thing because the household with the evil stepmother and the two stepsisters, who I forgot to mention earlier, now don't have any money coming in. They have to fire this huge staff they had, and Ella has to become basically their servant and is moved to the attic because she has such a large bedroom, and it'd be easier if the two stepsisters lived there instead. So Ella lives in the attic, but sometimes it gets cold and she falls asleep next to the fire as it's about to go out, and then she has all this ash on her face, and the stepsisters decide they will jokingly call her Cinderella, and then that is what she's known as she makes friends with mice, and then eventually meets the prince in the forest by chance, and they fall in love even though she doesn't know he's the prince. But then the prince decides to have a ball so he can meet her, and then of course, you know how the story goes. She has a dress, they rip it, the fairy godmother comes, Helena Bonham Carter plays the fairy godmother, and the rest kind of goes almost how it is, but with a lot more complications, because of course it's Hollywood in 2015, and if we're going to remake something, we can't just do it simply. We have to make it more complicated and make the movie go on and on far longer than it should. One of the things I really hate about remakes and when you're rebooting something, there's always a director and they come out and they go, we're really going to get into the backstory and learn how they became this, whatever this thing is that we're making the movie about them is. They never think about how that's going to work within the framework of the story. It's just kind of more of a bizarre kind of curiosity. I don't really like the idea of them doing that in horror movies, and now it's suddenly kind of creeped its way into mainstream films. It's something that makes you think about things like that with a friend, but it's never really that interesting to see in a movie. They do flesh out a lot of the characters that in the original Disney animated film, the story's been around in various iterations for a very long time. In the Disney film, they don't really flesh out Cinderella. They don't really flesh out the prince. And in this, they do that, and they actually have them have more of a romance than yeah, we met this one time and danced and shit. They get more into it, and they do the same thing with the stepmother played by Cate Blanchett. You kind of understand where she's coming from. She's still the evil stepmother, but you get a little more perspective on why she feels that way and how she's in this situation, which sure, that is something that other film is lacking. So it's actually a little more natural than in most cases, but they're a little too heavy-handed with all that. So you're spending in Cinderella in something that took maybe 30 seconds to explain. In this movie, it takes a half hour. They just dwell on it too long. We didn't even see Lily James for a while because you have to go through her being a kid and all this stuff. There are certain things that are actually good about it, like Kenneth Branagh. I haven't really liked his mainstream work since he's got Thor and then did Jack Ryan's Shadow Recruit. He wasn't really good at doing big action movies, but Cinderella kind of works a little more towards his temperament. It's a lot more traditional in its adaptation. There's far less cuts than I'm used to from Kenneth Branagh, which thank God, because he's not very good at quick cutting. I still think Kenneth Branagh currently just feels like a crap studio director. This just felt like a crap studio director trying to be a lot more respectful. I have to admit, I actually thought the direction worked a lot better than it had with like Jack Ryan or Thor, although I think the theory of it doesn't exactly work. And I think that's one of the things with these Disney kind of retreading these fairy tales that they covered with their animated films. Cinderella's in the public domain, like Warner Brothers can make a Cinderella, MGM, anybody. Disney obviously like has their stamp on it so hard. Clearly they probably would have liked to have made a Snow White if other studios hadn't beat them to it. They're not really exactly saying anything new with the story, or saying anything at all with the story, or anything about the story of Cinderella that we didn't really already cover in the 1950 animated film. And that's not the greatest told story, and certainly actually of all the Disney movies you could make a live action film out of, theoretically Cinderella would work the best because it goes into the mouse stuff a little too much. It's streamlined in a lot of places. It doesn't really tell you the backstory of the prince. There's a lot of things that are left that you could really have fun with, and this film does it in a very natural kind of modern way, which is totally boring. The thing about doing these modern day attempts on it is you think, oh, it's going to be more natural. We have CG now, when you're not really saying anything with it. And I feel like Frozen kind of said more about Disney princess films and fairy tale films that Disney has made than any of these movies have. These just feel like brand recognition that Disney, which they refer to these films as a franchise in itself, they just look at these as films that people go, oh, they made a live action Cinderella, I love Cinderella. Or, this is kind of a weird franchise because you look at any other franchise in modern Hollywood, you have some producer that's really invested in that subject matter. It's like a Kevin Feige or somebody who's really into it, and this one doesn't really have that, so it's just kind of like a mishmash of let's do this fairy tale now. And it does feel kind of like they just kind of know they have to do this, so they're kind of just trying to get it to work. It almost feels like a Simon Pictures in the old studio days, but without a director trying to get their vision through that assignment. Kenneth Branagh does that a little bit with this, and being a lot more traditional and kind of feeling like the Kenneth Branagh that made like a weird version of Hamlet in the 90s, a little more than you've seen through Thor. I don't know much about him actually before Thor. I understand he was actually fairly respected, which I don't get through Thor, Jack Ryan, or even this. If you're just going to be retelling it, like what exactly is the point? And I don't think this film really knows that, but doing it in kind of a modern way where I understand all these things and you're trying to update it, and then still have like the CG sameness that's going on all throughout these films. And the scene where she gets the dress is not really even that magical at all, because it just looks like a million other big CG sequences in a million other movies. And Kenneth Branagh is not particularly great at doing special effects sequences anyway. The ending, which I thought worked a lot better in the 1950 film, is far more complicated and goes on for like 20 minutes for no reason at all. It doesn't strengthen the story or the narrative. It just felt like they wanted to like make it more complicated just because that's modern screenwriting. It's weird because he directed it in a traditional way, but it was written in such a boring modern way that like I kind of wish the writing had reflected the direction. And why have the mice in this? Because they don't really add anything. They don't have long mice sequences or anything like in the original. A mouse like Gus Gus, who was in the 1950 film. Certainly you want to drill home when you think Cinderella, you better think Disney, because we don't own the rights, so you better think that, because it's easier if we just control your mind. Cinderella shows that Disney really thinks that you feel it's their story, but because they are using that evil studio power to like control this, they're not really thinking about proving it to us. This film doesn't really become the exception to the rule that it kind of is. In some ways, yeah, sure, it's probably going to end up being one of the better versions of these Disney studio retreads of fairy tales. The thing is, with all of them, Frozen said more about them than all of them did, and made points about them that people still talk about, and no one talks about the points that Maleficent made. In Cinderella, it feels like more of a traditional kind of direction, but it's done in the kind of modern Hollywood screenwriting way that I just don't like. I don't want to know more of the backstory. I want to know more of the backstory that works for the story and for the character. In certain parts of Cate Blanchett, yeah, that worked a little bit, but it still made me think she was an evil stepmother. I still hated her. I still felt bad for Cinderella, And I don't know if taking longer to explain it makes the point more valid than if you explain it quickly. There were certain things they could have done that were more developing of the characters without just blandly doing the backstory arc that everybody does. The script really held it back. It's terrible attempts at humor. This was a really terribly bad studio film and probably the least enjoyable time I've had in a major big budget movie in 2015 so far, because I'm sure this film was more expensive than Taken 3 and Strange Magic. It just became really groan inducing as it went on. As much as it could kind of win me over with saying like, hey, I don't hate Kenneth Branagh as much this time, they would make a dumb joke, or they'd have to explain this thing, or someone would die of a thing that like they don't everyone just died of things they never explain. They're like, I'm dying, you know, I have the thing that people had whenever this was. A lot of films, even the films I like, are built on brand recognition, but this is all brand recognition and no storytelling. And as much as it tries to be something different, it isn't. It's nothing different. It's just Disney pushing their agenda on you and not really much else. And you know what they used to do before the theatrical market changed so much is they would used to just re-release Cinderella or re-release Alice in Wonderland or Sleeping Beauty, and they don't do that anymore. They make these movies, and frankly, I wish they would go back, because I'm sick of these. I will always like the Disney animated films. It'd probably be a lot nicer if I saw Cinderella on the big screen. I would have actually enjoyed that. I would have had a good time. And instead, I'm watching a crappier version of my childhood memories. Why would anyone go, hey, you like this thing? What if I made it worse? And that's basically what Disney's doing, but with like a creepy corporate overlord mentality that just accentuates the worst thoughts you have about the Disney studios. So if you have seen Cinderella and you would like to talk about it, then comment below in the comments and subscribe if you would like to. And check out my review of the 1950 Cinderella animated Disney classic, which will have an annotation below. Thank you very much for watching, and I hope to see you next time.